So let's start with question number 10. Can we see a simple example of how WCF transactions work? In question number 9, we have seen all the theory which is related to WCF transactions. In this question, we will see that how we can actually implement WCF transaction. So what we'll do is that we will create two WCF services, WCF service 1 and WCF service 2. Now both of these services will be inserting records into a customer table. Now this table basically has three fields: customer ID, which is an identity field, customer code, and customer name. We will be also building a client which will basically call both of these services in one transaction. So our client will be called as WCF transactions, and this client will call both of these services in one transaction. So what we'll do is that when the scenario is successful, that means WCF service 1 and WCF service 2 is successful, we'll see that how the insertion happens in the table, and when let's say that one of the service fails, how the transaction rolls back. So with this we will be able to visualize that how we can use WCF transactions in projects. The first step which we need to do for enabling transactions in WCF is that we need to attribute our operation contract with the transaction flow attribute. So what I've done is that I have created a method here called as update data, and I want that this update data should be called in a transaction. So what we need to do for that is that we need to enable this update data method with a transaction flow attribute. Now there are a lot of options which you can specify with the transaction flow: allowed, mandatory, and not allowed. The not allowed option is by default. So in other words, if you don't specify a transaction flow option to operation contract, that means that that function will never take participation in a transaction. And in case if the client calls up the method in a transaction, it will be just ignored. Allowed specifies that the client can call this WCF service in a transaction or without a transaction. So it is not a compulsory thing that that the service needs to be called in a transaction. The third one is mandatory, which specifies that the client must call this WCF service in a transaction mode. And in case if the client is calling without a transaction mode, it will throw up an exception. So the first step, you need to define your operation contract and ensure that your operation contract is been attributed with the transaction flow attribute. Now there are two more important steps which we need to follow in order to enable transactions in WCF. So we have already defined the first step. We have already done. We have defined our interface, and we have defined that the transaction flow is true for this method. The second thing is we need to implement the interface. So I've implemented the update data interface. In the implementation, what I'm doing is that I'm just making a simple insert into the customer table. Now in order that this implementation should be a part of the transaction, we need to specify the operation behavior, and in the operation behavior we need to specify that the transaction scope required is true. So this is the second change we need to do. The third change is that we need to ensure that our binding which are taking part in the transaction has to be transaction enabled. At this moment we are going to use WS HTTP binding. So we need to ensure that the transaction flow is true, and that is done by specifying the transaction flow attribute. And this binding name we need to specify in our binding configuration. So here's our endpoint. So we have specified that the binding configuration is transaction bind, transactional bind, and you can see that the transactional bind basically says that the transaction flow is enabled. So this is the third change. So three things we need to do in our WCF service: ensure that our interface is transaction flow enabled, that is, it has been attributed by using transaction flow. Second, our implementation has the operation behavior with transaction scope required equal to true. Third, our WS HTTP binding is also transaction enabled. So now that we are ready that our WCF service is being enabled for transaction. Now what I've done for this example is that all these same changes I have done for WCF service 2. So even WCF service 2 is basically having an update data interface, it's having an implementation, okay, and the same changes I have specified in the web.config file. So the same thing, it's the exact replica of WCF service 1, only that when we make an insert into the customer table, we are inserting data as service 2 and service 2. That is, in the customer name we are inserting from service 2 and from service 2 in the customer code. But while the insert comes from the service 1, we are inserting service from service 1 and service 1, so that we can identify that this insert has come from service 1 or it has come from service 2. Now what we'll do is that we will try to call both of these services in one transaction in our WCF's transaction client. So let's start with the final step. We need to call both these services in one transaction. So the first thing is that you need to reference both the WCF services, and you can see that I have referenced both the WCF services in my client. Second is you need to import the system.transaction namespace. So that's one more thing which you need to ensure. Now what I've done is that I have created objects of both the services and I'm calling the update data method. Now update data method basically makes inserts into the customer table, and both of these transaction is being scoped using the transaction scope object. So you can see that the transaction scope basically puts a boundary, saying that these transactions or these WCF services will be called in one transaction. In case everything is fine, I'm just saying the transaction scope to complete. In case there are issues, I'm saying please roll back using dispose. So in this way I have ensured that both of these services are called in one transaction. So now what we'll do is that we'll just run this client, okay. In order to see that how it actually works, I'll just put a debug here. At this moment our customer table doesn't have any records. Let's just check it. Show table data. I'll just fire the query and I can see that there are no records currently, right? So let me ensure that this is set as startup. That is my client, and we have put a debug into the transaction scope statement so that we can see that how the transaction is entered. Okay, so let's run in the debug mode. Now because there are no errors, both of these transactions should commit and we should be able to see records inserted from service 1 and service 2 in the customer table. So all these things I'm calling up in the page load event. So that defines a transaction scope. So create service 1, update data, create service 2, update data, and then finally commit the transaction. Now if you go to the customer table, you will see that both of these transactions are completed. So in other words, what has happened is, let me also go and just come out of the scope, right? Probably it has put a lock, so let me just come out of the scope and complete the page load. Right, now you can see that WCF service 1 has inserted from service 1 and WCF service 2 has inserted the from service 2 record. Let me just go and delete this, and let me put an error inside the code. So let me stop this debug and let me just throw exception after the first service insert is called. So what I'm doing is that I'm saying that once you call the service reference 1, we'll throw up exception. So in other words, the service reference 1 insert will not happen in the table. And what I've done is that I have deleted all the records which were inserted now. Okay, so now let's see how this works. So let's go to our page load. Because I'm using the MSDE SQL, so it's a bit slow. Okay, so let me again run this, and this time none of the records should be inserted in the customer table because both of these services are called in one transaction. So again, creating the scope of the transaction scope object, updating the data. Now here's the throw exception which happens. It goes to the catch and we say please go and roll back. So it goes and it says okay, dispose, and the code is completed, the execution is completed. Now let's go to the table and let's try to execute and see if really any inserts are made, and you can see that none of the inserts are made. So in other words, both of these services are called as one transactional unit. I hope that this session was useful. In case you are looking forward for the source code, you can get it from questpointvideo.com. When you are seeing the video, you will see at the right hand side there is a link to download the source code. In case you have bought the DVD, you can get it from the source code folder. Any technical issues, any kind of doubts, you can always email us at questpoint@questpoint.com. We are always here to reply back. I hope that this session was useful. In the coming up sessions, we'll see more in-depth materials in WCF from the WCF aspect.